Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for coming to our third stakeholder update. For those who are new to these updates, welcome. This presentation is open to anyone who is interested in learning more about extended producer responsibility, implementation of specifically EPR for paper and packaging in the US, learning about Circular Action Alliance, and our role as the producer responsibility organization that will support companies who have obligations under these EPR laws and work with all stakeholders to successfully implement these laws. I'm going to lay out the agenda for the session shortly, but before doing so, I just wanted to share a few housekeeping reminders that we always kick off with. First, as I mentioned at the beginning, we record these meetings. We do that to ensure that those who are unable to attend have an opportunity to learn about our activities. We turn off recording at the Q&A so participants can feel comfortable submitting questions and to encourage open discussion with our team. We're going to try and reserve the last 20 minutes or so for questions. We're not going to stop till we get to the end. We will be utilizing the Q&A feature in Zoom, not the chat feature. So please feel free to enter questions in the Q&A box as they occur to you, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible at the end. We'll be looking at them throughout the presentation. We'll do our best to sort of summarize and combine questions on similar themes. And we'll also make note of questions that we're not able to get to today, or questions that are very specific to an industry or company and may be more appropriate for an individual response. If you submit your question as anonymous, we won't be able to follow up with you on it afterwards, but if you include your name, we can look up your info and get back to you with an answer. If you have questions that occur to you after this presentation, you are more than welcome to send them to us at info@circularaction.org. And I may ask my colleague Sydney just to type our contact info into the chat there. And we can also reiterate that at the end of this presentation. Again, this Q&A session and call is designed for stakeholders. It's not designed for media. We have not restricted access to this forum, but we are requesting that media not ask questions during this session, and we're very happy to take media questions or follow-ups via our media mailbox, which is media@circularaction.org. Finally, this is always a question that comes up multiple times as people join late, so bear with us as we say it over and over, but we will be distributing this presentation and a link to the recording with those who registered within a few days. So with that, let's go to our agenda slide, please, Mark. Great. Here is our agenda for today's update. We're going to do a very quick review of why we're here, touching on what packaging EPR is, what a producer responsibility or pro is, and who Circular Action is. Spoiler alert, we're a pro. And that's for anyone who may want a refresher or be new to the discussion. I think we can provide links to our first two stakeholder updates in the email that we send out to those who registered for today. And you'll find that those updates have a bit more detailed background information, a bit more of an EPR 101 and info about how this organization came to be. Then we're going to touch on the key milestones for EPR and CAA's progress in 2023 before jumping into the activities that we'll be focusing on in 2024. We'll do a closer look at Oregon's law and the program planning process. Our team is working across a number of states, and all states are at different stages in the implementation process. But Oregon is the first state to require a program plan, and that is due in March of this year. So given that timeline, we wanted to give a bit of a preview of what's to come there, and we'll certainly be able to provide more detail in future sessions. And then we'll wrap up with Q&A. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, we're not going to do intros up front. I will briefly share that I am leading our communications, stakeholder engagement, and producer recruitment work. And I'll be taking us through the first part of this update. I'm joined by my colleagues Shane, John, and Doug, and they will be providing updates at different points and will introduce themselves briefly before they speak. Next slide, please. And next slide. We're going to jump right into our refreshers on why we're here. Great. So again, super high level review of what EPR is and does and CAA's role. So at the highest level, extended producer responsibility is a policy approach that makes the companies that put products, or in this case, products using packaging, or products that are considered packaging-like items, into the market. The companies put those products into the market. It makes them responsible for their management at the end of life. In the case of packaging EPR, this means the costs associated with recycling packaging are paid for by those companies, as opposed to municipalities and taxpayers. There are 4 states in the US that have passed EPR laws for packaging. That's California, Colorado, Maine, and Oregon. There's a few states that have passed laws to study EPR, which we can touch on briefly. And as we've said ad nauseum in previous sessions, these states all have slightly different requirements, definitions of covered materials or the packaging that is in scope under these laws, of who is obligated to pay for those materials, and of what share of the recycling system costs those entities who are typically known as producers are taking on. And this is what we're referring to when we say that producers either partially or fully fund the system here on this slide. We're not going to get into the nuances between the states here, although John is going to break down some of the core requirements in just a couple slides. But I would encourage producers in particular to familiarize themselves with the requirements, to join our monthly producer working group meetings, which we can touch on at the end as well, because those are sessions in which we've started to break down some of these differences and their implications from a compliance perspective. And again, more info on the producer working group at the end of this presentation. Now, one of the reasons that we have these special sessions for producers is because the job of the pro is to help producers meet their obligations under EPR laws and be a central organization that is collecting producer packaging data, assigning specific fees that are based on the costs of managing that packaging and covered materials, and then collecting those fees from producers based on the volume and type of material that they are supplying into a state that has a packaging EPR law. The pro develops and manages the implementation of a program plan, which, at a high level, again, describes how the organization, on behalf of all producers and in partnership with other recycling system stakeholders, is going to achieve higher recycling rates and other requirements and performance targets within the laws. Um, Quick note on CAA, we formed in late 2022 to help producers fulfill their responsibilities. And because all US EPR laws require the formation of a producer responsibility or stewardship organization. Most states only allow for one pro at the beginning of an EPR program, with the exception of Oregon, which allows for multiple pros at program outset. And my colleague Doug will touch on that in a few slides. I'm going to show you the companies that helped form CAA and are leading the organization on the next slide, but do want to reinforce that this is an organization that will have to work with all producers, particularly in states where there is only one pro. And California and Colorado are 2 such states, and I'm pleased to share for anyone who may be new here or not receiving our updates that CAA has been approved as the single pro in both of those states, and that's a new development as of the beginning of the year here for California in particular. CAA has also been approved as a single pro to represent producer interests and serve as a member of an advisory council that will make recommendations on what a future program or future legislation for packaging EPR could look like in Maryland. And those recommendations will go to the Maryland governor and legislature. So that is not, Maryland does not have a law that has created an EPR program, but sort of a study process that we've been selected to participate in. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are working on our program plans in Oregon, and we are engaging in the regulatory process in Maine, and we'll get into some of those state-specific updates in just a moment. Next slide, please. Great. So, bit of late breaking news here. Well, here are the companies that founded and are leading CAA, and the late breaking news is that we just announced today the addition of 2 new founding members, and that is Danone and Mondelez. And I wanted to acknowledge that, to thank them for participating in and investing in this group. We're thrilled to have their experience and expertise at the table, and feel it really rounds out the group of leaders from a variety of industries that represent a large diversity of the packaging materials that will be covered under US EPR laws. Again, we will be working with and have agreements with all producers, but the leadership of this group and now the addition of Danone and Mondelez is critical to ensure that we are equipped to meet the requirements of the different state EPR laws. And now I think I'm passing the mic to my colleague, John.
Thanks so much, Olivia. Welcome, everybody. My name is John Haidt. I sit between the stakeholder engagement and regulatory teams here at CAA. Mark, if we could go to the next slide. We've got a lot of additional content that we want to bring to you, and for many of you who have been paying close attention, this may be very familiar. At our October webinar, we did share an overview of the different states at a high level, but we put this slide together, hopefully to just ground those of you who might be newer to the conversation in some of the specifics at a slight dial down from what Olivia shared 2 slides ago, and Doug especially will be sharing more details on Oregon's program a bit later in today's presentation. But just to give you all a thumbnail sketch across the states of what the requirements look like, in terms of covered materials, all 4 states include packaging to various extents, depending on the precise definition of packaging within the statute. In their programs, 3 of the states include single-use food serviceware in the scope of their program, and 2 of the states, Oregon and Colorado, include paper and paper materials, to, paper writing and writing paper to various extents. Turning to the sectors in which those covered materials are sent, all 4 states include residential material, and all 4 states, to varying extents, include commercial material. California and Oregon cover the breadth and width of commercial material, including B2C and B2B material, while Colorado and Maine include some B2C material. In terms of general system funding, this is where things get very complex, and the general system funding here, most of these entities or most of these requirements are managed by the approved pro in each state, or pros, on behalf of producers. And again, the details here are pretty extensive. Doug will do a bit of a dial in on some of the requirements in Oregon, but at that 30,000 foot level, all 4 states require producers to varying degrees to fund and in some cases manage the end of life of covered materials. All 4 states require producers through the approved pro or pros to conduct education and investments. A couple of unique callouts. California includes a $500 million per year plastic pollution mitigation payment into a fund that rolls out for 10 years with $500 million over 10 years. That's $5 billion over 10 years. And that fund will be dedicated to plastic pollution intervention and prevention measures. And worth calling out as well that Maine includes not just payments for recycling of covered materials, but also includes disposal. There are also a number of states that have passed requirements for the development of needs assessments. In most cases, those are needs assessments that are either being conducted directly by state agencies or being contracted out by third parties. As Olivia mentioned, Maryland is one of those states. CAA won't necessarily be directly involved in the needs assessment process in Maryland, but we will be sitting on the advisory council in Maryland as that council works through its process. So with that, I will turn it back over to Olivia to give an overview of 2023. A look in the rearview mirror.
Thanks, John. And we'll move through this quickly because I think that the key question on everyone's mind is what's next. So next slide, please. The year in review timeline. Great. Again, I'm going to move through this briefly as some of this was covered in earlier slides. But to summarize our activities in 2023, we were focused on continuing to build out our organization. Again, this is a relatively new organization. Founded in 2022. Our board officially formed at the beginning of the year, so lots of work to do to get up and running. But that did not slow us down from immediately engaging with the stakeholder community, different groups across the states as well as nationally, and preparing to meet the requirements of the first states that had pro application deadlines in particular. So that's Colorado and California. You can see on the slide there the approval dates that we had that we met, and as well as in Maryland. And again, that's a bit of a separate set of considerations and process, as John indicated. Throughout all of this, we were building out teams to ensure that we could follow the developments and engage in the regulatory process, as well as start building the relationships that will be critical to successful implementation of all packaging laws, packaging EPR laws. So this includes activities like participating in the regulatory process in California, Oregon, and Maine, responding to draft rule concepts in those states, participate and draft rules specifically, participating formally in rulemaking advisory committees. For example, in Oregon, we had a formal role there, and starting to educate the producer community along the way. In Colorado, since we were approved there quite early on, and there was a really tight timeline for some of our first obligations, we had to hit the ground running to deliver the needs assessment. And that included hiring a third party contractor as required by law and overseeing work on that needs assessment, which the was really a process in which we evaluated the existing services and infrastructure in Colorado, and how single-use packaging and paper products are currently managed at the end of product life. And then together with our consultants who were HDR and Eunomia, we sort of evaluated again what is happening for that material, whether it's collected at curbside or at drop-off locations, how is it being managed at transfer stations, at material recovery facilities or compost sites, and how is it ultimately getting to either in-state or out-of-state end markets. And that is really to provide a solid view of the state of the system today to inform program planning, and importantly, to identify gaps in existing services and opportunities to improve systems so that we can drive towards meeting and exceeding Colorado's statewide waste diversion goals, as well as goals and different scenarios that are getting outlined in that needs assessment, describing, what kind of improvements are possible based on what we learned in Colorado and the level of investment required to make those improvements. So the needs assessment will be delivered to the state regulator, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, in the coming days, and will certainly be the subject of future stakeholder updates. Some of our other core activities were officially indicating to Oregon Department of Environmental Quality that we want to be a pro. That was a formal letter of intent process. And of course, beginning our program plan development, which I'm not going to speak to here as Doug is going to get into those details in a few moments. Next slide, please. Great. I just want to briefly thank all of those who engaged with us in the past year. There has been a tremendous amount of interest in packaging EPR in the US and in CAA, and all of these conversations have been really helpful to informing our approaches in the different states. We do a lot of updating via these kinds of presentation, conferences, and our monthly newsletter. We recognize that all producers and other stakeholders are at very different places in their journey to understand packaging EPR and what implementation here will look like. But there have also been incredible dialogues as well, and we expect these conversations to become more and more frequent as we move through the implementation processes in each state. So just a quick shout out to all those who've engaged with us, and to encourage you to continue to join these conversations. And please sign up for our monthly newsletter on our website if you're not already receiving that. We are also continuously updating the content on our website. So with that, I think I am kicking it over to John to start us on what's ahead for 2024.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Olivia. One more, please, Mark. So just to kick off, we've gotten a lot of questions from producers about registration and what the registration process with CAA will look like, considering that CAA is now approved in both Colorado and California. To start off, Colorado has included the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, CDPHE, the agency that's overseeing the development of the program, has included a proposed producer registration deadline of July 1st of 2024 in their proposed rules. Those draft rules will be wrapping up in the middle of this year, so quite close to the registration deadline. The registration deadline really just requires producers to provide their contact information to CAA. And so we've put together a form that's accessible here through the QR code, and we can also send it around in the follow-up for producers or potentially obligated producers who believe that they will be obligated under Colorado's statute to fill out that form and provide us their contact information so that we then can follow up with sort of the next steps in the registration process to ensure that producers are in compliance. But considering that CAA has been approved in California and is also working towards other state approval, we have included all of the states that have an EPR for packaging requirement in place, and are asking producers to fill out whether or not they believe that they may be an obligated producer in those states as well, just so that we can have that information and follow back up with any relevant compliance information for producers. With that, I will pass it over to Shane, who's going to give us a walkthrough on state updates.
Great. Thank you very much, John. And my name's Shane Buckingham, and I'm the EPR Program Planning Lead for Circular Action Alliance. So overseeing the development and implementation of program plans in the states where CAA is implementing. So we'll start with Colorado. A lot of work has been undertaken by our team and our two needs assessment contractors, HDR and Eunomia. We're very close to completing the needs assessment and submitting that to CDPHE in the coming week here. There's a meeting that is still taking place with the Colorado Advisory Board to get some additional feedback on the recycling scenarios that will be included in the needs assessment. And this is an important document that will be submitted to CDPHE because the regulator needs to select one of the scenarios that will be recommended to the Joint Budget Committee and will be considered on or before March 15th. And if approved, that recycling scenario will be used as a foundation for the program plan proposal that Circular Action Alliance will be developing and consulting on with producers and other stakeholders ahead of the implementation process. In California, we spent a lot of time preparing our application, which was submitted late last year, and we received that approval notice early in January, a lot faster than we had expected. So it is now a focus on the draft rules that have been released to make sure that that supports the implementation planning. And if you're wondering about our initial implementation plan, we did include some of that direction within our application package, which is on CalRecycle's website. We're also looking at some other areas. There are consultations underway on SB 343, and then the advisory board will be having its first meeting and we'll be participating in that, and that's on February 2nd. So that's the update on California. Moving over to Oregon, we continue to be engaged in the rulemaking process. Rulemaking started some time ago in 2022, and we continue to work on that. But our key focus is the development and submission of a program plan ahead of March 31st. We had submitted a letter of intent to the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality last year, indicating that we had the intention to develop and submit a program plan by the end of March. And as part of that letter of intent, we indicated that we exceeded the 10% market share threshold to act as a pro in Oregon. Maine is an area where we're mainly focused on monitoring and responding to the draft rules. There will be an RFP that's issued by Maine DEP for the stewardship organization, and that will not be happening until 2025. So that's another jurisdiction where we're monitoring what's happening, but we're the approved pro in Colorado and California, prepared to submit in Oregon, monitoring what's going on in Maine. And then as for Maryland, we received approval to be the pro representing the interests of producers on the Producer Responsibility Advisory Council. We're still awaiting the announcement of that, and we have selected our representative and indicated that back to the government of Maryland. And this advisory council, as Olivia noted earlier in the presentation, is going to be evaluating a needs assessment that will be conducted and then will inform a set of recommendations developed by the advisory council and will be submitted to the governor. So this is focused on the research and getting the legislation right, whereas in Colorado, California, Oregon, we're focused on implementation. Okay, I think in the presentation now, I will turn it over to Doug, who's going to take us through Oregon.
Thanks, Shane. My name's Doug Mander. I'm CEA's Oregon Program Manager, and I'm working with our project team to develop the program plan that will be submitted at the end of next March. And I'd like to just give a bit of an overview of how the RMA works in Oregon before turning it back to my colleague Shane to just run through the 2024 timelines that we're working under. So if we could go to the next slide. The Oregon RMA is really an EPR statute that creates a shared funding model. So producers are obligated through the statute to pay for a number of recycling activities related to their packaging, but local governments and their service providers retain certain obligations under the statute as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but the Act anticipates PROS funding improvements in the system expansions and improvements for recycling throughout the state, including new on-route collection in some areas, new depots in other areas. Contemplates a statewide education campaign for a statewide uniform collection list. So right now, what's collected in the curbside system in Oregon depends on the local municipality or jurisdiction. The state is going to move to a uniform list to reduce public confusion about what can be recycled. And the PROS will work with local governments to implement a statewide education campaign in support of that new list. The PROS are also supporting the processing facilities by paying them contamination management fees and processing risk fees, which should protect Oregon ratepayers from further increases in rates associated with some of the Act's provisions. The Act also creates a prevention and reuse fund to fund initiatives that reduce the environmental impacts of covered products. So there's a lot of different elements in the Act that the producers are responsible to pay for in the statute. And one of the key ones is that bullet point at in the bottom is that the Act implements a requirement that anything that's collected for recycling in the state has to go to a responsible end market. So the producer responsibility organization is going to be required to work with processing facilities to verify that all of the material that's collected for recycling through the curbside systems and the other systems in the state are in fact being recycled at responsible end markets that meet environmental standards, et cetera. So that's the sort of the broad overview in terms of the improvement. The next slide goes into a little bit more detail about how it works in relation to different materials. So there are different categories of materials under the RMA. And as I mentioned previously, there's a new statewide uniform collection list. So the local governments and their service providers will be obligated to collect those materials and then have them transferred to licensed processing facilities. And those processing facilities will now require to be permitted. They have to meet certain standards that will be created in the statute, and they have to sell their material to responsible end markets. PROS support that system by funding system expansions on the part of local governments, and the DEQ conducted a preliminary needs assessment in 2023, where local governments indicated that they were interested in expanding the system as part of the RMA, and we're anticipating that there'll be kind of a phase 2 needs assessment that takes place shortly after PROS submit program plans this year. So 2024 will see that issue revisited, and PROS will be reaching out to local governments in 2024 to get more details on the type of improvements that each of the local communities are looking for under the RMA. PROS are also obligated to fund transportation over 50 miles from reload facilities and recycling depots to processing facilities. And that's an initiative that's intended to expand and support recycling in areas of the state that may be farther away from recycling infrastructure. There's also new funding for contamination reduction initiatives to educate consumers about what should go in the curbside system and what shouldn't. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the PROS are also paying processing facilities fees to cover their costs of processing the commingled material that's collected by local governments. And then finally, the PROS responsible for setting up a system to verify that recycled materials are recycled at responsible end markets. The state is also creating a kind of a parallel collection system for a set of materials that aren't on the curbside list. And this applies to materials that are a little bit more problematic to collect in a commingled stream. So the Department of Environmental Quality has designated 10 materials to be collected through a system of pro collection points. And with respect to this category of materials, pros are 100% responsible for designing and funding the collection of these materials, subject to convenience and performance standards that have been created under the statute. So this will be a parallel collection system that operates in conjunction with curbside throughout the state for different materials. And glass is an example of one material that would be collected throughout in the pro acceptance depot system. And the pros also have to work closely with local government depots and existing collection points in designing that system. So if there is a local depot that's already collecting some recycling materials, they have a kind of a right of first refusal with respect to working with the pro as a collection spot for the pro acceptance list materials as well. And then finally, under this act, there's a category of materials called specifically identified materials, which have recently been designated by the Department of Environmental Quality. And those materials, the pro is responsible for describing any efforts they will take to support collection, processing, and recycling materials. So these materials could be something that's not on either one of those two lists. And an example would be PET thermoforms, which DEQ has designated as a specifically identified material, or a SIM. So we will include in our plan a process by which we think that material could be managed. And so that's the overview of how the different material lists work under the statute. If we jump to the next slide, I'll just kind of step back a little bit and run through how the key obligations work for different program participants. So from the perspective of producers, you're obligated to join a pro, and you're obligated to report the packaging supplied to the state on an annual basis. And then you're obligated to pay annual fees to the pro based on your supply data, which then enables the pro to fund all of the activities and obligations it has under the statute. The 25 largest producers under the new RMA program are also obligated to conduct life cycle evaluations on at least 1% of their products every 2 years. And then finally, collectively, the producer responsibility organization has to hit statewide plastic recycling goals, which are specified in the statute and which increase over time. From the perspective of local governments, they still are the primary collection agent for curbside materials. They have to identify the service expansions that they want through the needs assessment process that I referenced, and those needs assessment initiatives are designed to expand recycling services throughout the state and do a better job of collecting materials on the USCL. They would also be administering a lot of the education and outreach programs in consultation with the producer responsibility organization. So the Act really envisions a lot of collaboration between producers, local governments, and then local waste management service providers. And so the pro, we have been, in terms of program plan development, talking to some local governments and service providers as we design proposals for the program plan. And I think there'll be a lot more consultation anticipated for 2024 as we put some initial proposals together in the plan to address various pro obligations, and then consult much more extensively with local governments, as I mentioned in a second needs assessment after those program plans are submitted. The local waste management processors are now required to get permits from DEQ and operate to new standards that are created under the RMA. And they have an obligation, as do pros, to ensure the materials that they're selling are being sold to responsible end markets. So that's another area where producers and processors need to collaborate. If there's a problem with a responsible end market, for example, the pros are expected to collaborate with the processing facilities to resolve those problems and ensure that materials are going to responsible end markets. So that's a kind of an overview of how the various obligations work under the statute. And I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Shane to run through what we can expect for 2024 in terms of the timelines and some of the formal steps that we go through as we develop the program plan.
Yeah, thanks for that. Hitting the wrong button. You can go to the next slide. So we're, as mentioned, in the process of finalizing our program plan submission for March 31st, and that's going to undergo a review by the Oregon Recycling System Advisory Council, the regulator, the Department of Environmental Quality, and because there are two pros, there's a pro interim coordination process that will need to be undertaken as well. Once we make that submission, we expect that we'll have to resubmit as part of the process going through interim coordination with the other producer responsibility organization. And at that point, we will undertake a consultation process and we will consult with producers and other stakeholders in the development and resubmission of that program plan in September. Once those resubmissions are made, then ORSAC and DEQ will conduct a review of those plans. And if there are multiple pros, there will be an interim coordination plan or a coordination plan in place. And then that will undergo another round of stakeholder consultation and implementation as we move towards the implementation date of July 1st, 2025. So there's a lot on the go in Oregon. This is also as we're going through similar processes in Colorado and in California. So stay tuned for further updates as we move forward. At this time, I think we are at the end of the presentation and we are going to start to take some questions now. We've had questions come in during the presentation, so I will turn it over to Olivia. And you're on mute.
All right, still muted. Happens from time to time. So I am going to ask that we stop the recording now and we'll try and get to as many of these questions as possible.